In the elegant streets of Boston, Caroline Barnes's small apartment maintained its tranquility. The morning sun entered through the window, illuminating her tired face as she sighed. Caroline had worked at a local family-owned accounting firm for 5 years, but that morning was her last day. "I'm sorry, Caroline, with this recession we simply cannot continue," said Mr. Green, the owner of the firm, with his head down. The economic crisis caused by the pandemic had finally taken the small accounting firm. Returning home, Caroline emptied the contents of her drawer onto the table: a letter of recommendation, her last paycheck, and some photographs. She took a sip of coffee and opened her computer to look for a job once again. She had been applying daily for 3 months, but throughout Boston, companies had frozen hiring. Her savings were dwindling day by day, and paying the rent on her apartment was becoming increasingly difficult. Caroline's parents owned a luxurious mansion in Newton, a suburb of Boston. Her father, Walter, was the founder of Barnes Construction, a major construction company. Her mother, Martha, was a renowned local philanthropist. Her sister, Becky, was a senior executive at her father's company and was destined to take the reins of the business eventually. Since childhood, Caroline had been raised under strict discipline. Her father, in particular, had high expectations for her. "Don't tarnish the Barnes name," he often told her. However, his attention was always focused on Becky. Becky had been an exemplary student, and upon joining her father's company, she demonstrated outstanding skills, rising quickly. Caroline, on the other hand, chose a different path. After finishing high school, Walter proposed she work in the family business. But she refused. "I want to follow my own path," she insisted. She majored in accounting in college and tried to build her career on her own merit, without the help of her family. "Follow your own path? Don't talk nonsense," Walter exploded. "Our company offers you lifetime stability, and you reject it." That decision cooled the relationship between Caroline and her family. A rift formed, especially with her sister, Becky. Becky always met her father's expectations and considered Caroline's decision an absurd rebellion. They barely spoke in several years. "I would undoubtedly choose Dad's company over uncertain independence," Becky thought. "Your pride will come back to haunt you someday," Becky told Caroline in their last private conversation. In her apartment, Caroline looked out the window and quickly posted on social media. "Lost my job today. Seeking a new path." She didn't communicate directly with her family, but her post didn't go unnoticed by Becky. "Look, it seems they fired Caroline," Becky commented as she entered her father's office. Walter looked up from his papers and smiled slightly. "Reality isn't so sweet after all." Later, Martha called, saying she was worried about Caroline and unexpectedly invited her to Thanksgiving dinner. Ostensibly, it was a gesture of family support, but something in her mother's tone seemed strange to her. It didn't sound like genuine concern but rather a kind of satisfaction. She looked at the rent bill and sighed deeply. She had lost her job, had no prospects for a next paycheck, and her situation was becoming increasingly difficult. She didn't want to accept the invitation, but she had no other choice. She needed to be honest about her situation and ask for help, even if it was temporary. Swallowing her pride, she replied, "Thank you, Mom. I'll go." On Thanksgiving night, as silence blanketed the streets of Boston, Caroline took a deep breath in front of Le Chat, the exclusive restaurant her family had chosen. She put on an elegant black dress to feign confidence, although deep down her heart was filled with anxiety. While fixing her hair, she whispered to her reflection in the mirror, "It's okay, Caroline. It's just a family dinner. Put your pride aside and ask for their help." When the restaurant door opened, the warm air and refined aroma of the kitchen enveloped her. Elegant chandeliers illuminated the room, and classical music played softly. Le Chat, known as a luxury restaurant in Boston, was the typical choice for her family gatherings. "Ah, the reservation under Barnes," said the hostess with a smile. "Everyone is already waiting for you." Caroline followed the hostess to a luxurious private room in the back. With each step, she felt the weight of what was to come. When the door opened, she saw her family seated around an opulent table. "Caroline, it's been a while," Martha said with a friendly, albeit superficial, smile. Her eyes were cold. Her mother watched her as she held a glass of champagne. "Thank you, Mom," Caroline replied with a tense smile. You're late as always, Walter commented, looking at his watch. He wore an expensive, perfectly tailored suit and sat at the head of the table with his usual air of authority. I'm so sorry the train was delayed. And before Caroline could finish her excuse, Becky interrupted her. Excuses again. It was the same at work. That's why you were fired. She smiled maliciously. She wore a designer dress and a pearl necklace that shimmered in the restaurant's light. Caroline was momentarily speechless but managed to maintain her composure as she took a seat. The appetizers were already on the table, and the wine had been served. Let's make a toast, Martha said, raising her glass. To the united family. Everyone raised their glasses, but to Caroline they seemed strangely euphoric. Cheers, she murmured, barely taking a sip of wine. Then Caroline began. Walter, how have you been lately? Caroline thought she was prepared for that question, but she still felt a knot in her throat. The truth is, it's been difficult. I'm looking for a new job. Oh, that's complicated, Martha said in a voice that feigned sympathy, but her eyes seemed amused. But I'm sure you'll find something suited to your skills, Becky added with a mocking smile. The small accounting firm sank. You shouldn't have joined Dad's company from the beginning. As the meal progressed, the conversation seemed to flow normally on the surface, but little by little it always turned to Caroline's unemployment. Dish after dish, the waiters brought the chef's recommendations, but Caroline's throat felt increasingly tight. When the main course was served, Martha suddenly stood up and raised her glass with a radiant smile. Now this is a special celebration. Caroline frowned, confused. Celebration of what? She looked at the faces of each member of her family. They were all smiling as if sharing a private joke. Walter laughed slowly as he poured more wine. You were fired. That career wasn't for you. I knew you'd realize it sooner or later. But why are you celebrating my being fired? Caroline asked, her voice trembling and her expression pained. It's a good opportunity for you to face reality, Becky replied with a laugh before taking a sip of champagne. Don't worry, she added with a condescending smile. Maybe someone will hire you. Caroline was frozen by those words. Her family was celebrating her failure. Perhaps they had been waiting for this moment ever since she decided to go her own way years ago. I told you, Walter said sternly. Members of the Barnes family contribute to the family business. Your independence was just childish rebellion. Martha smiled coldly. You chose your own path, Caroline, and look how you ended up. Becky smiled triumphantly. Didn't I tell you that one day you were going to hurt yourself? How does it feel now? Her family's words crushed her. She could no longer continue eating. She had barely touched her steak while the rest of the family laughed and chatted, apparently enjoying her difficulties. You should admit it already, Martha said. You were wrong. That's right, Becky added. If you had worked with Dad like me, none of this would have happened. Caroline couldn't take it anymore. She put down her fork and slowly stood up. Her hands were shaking, but she held her head high. I didn't come here to be treated like this, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Again being dramatic, her mother rolled her eyes. Why don't you accept reality? You failed, Caroline, Becky said sarcastically. You should have joined Dad's company, but you decided to go your own way. She smiled as she took a sip of wine, enjoying her sister's pain. Do you think you can come home after failing? Walter asked coldly, his eyes reflecting contempt. You chose your destiny. Tears threatened to spill from Caroline's eyes, but she fought to contain them. Her cheeks were flushed with shame and anger. She never thought her family could be so cruel. She had come for help, but instead they were ridiculing her and celebrating her failure. At that moment, Robert Griffin, the restaurant manager who was nearby, had been listening to the conversation. Robert, a 45-year-old man, was the owner of a chain of luxury restaurants and had recently acquired Luchat. He had noticed the tension at the table as he passed by. Just as Caroline grabbed her purse and was about to leave, Robert approached her. Excuse me, Miss Barnes, he said politely. He was wearing a sophisticated black suit and had a warm smile. Could I speak with you for a moment? Caroline, confused and partly wanting to get away from her family, nodded. Robert led her to the bar, a little further from the table. I'm interested in your experience. I heard you worked at an accounting firm. Robert said softly. Yes, but now. Caroline started to speak, but Robert raised his hand in a calming gesture. Actually, my restaurant group is expanding, and I want to strengthen the management team. Could you come to my office tomorrow? Caroline looked at him in disbelief. Seriously? Of course, Robert replied seriously. Your skills are very valuable to us. I've been looking for someone with experience in financial management. Caroline glanced at her family's table. They were still drinking wine, celebrating her misfortune. She took a deep breath and turned to Robert. I'd like to consider it, she said, her voice regaining confidence. I'll come tomorrow. Robert handed her his business card. I'll wait for you at 10 a.m. tomorrow in my office on the second floor here. Caroline took the card and thanked him. Then she returned to her family's table and stood with a dignified attitude. Thank you for the celebration, she said calmly. But this might be our last dinner together. Her family looked at her in confusion at her sudden change in attitude. What do you mean? Becky asked. Caroline just smiled without answering. She slung her purse over her shoulder and walked away gracefully. Her family remained at the table with perplexed expressions as she left the restaurant. Stepping onto the sidewalk, she felt she could breathe freely for the first time in hours. She still had anger and sadness in her heart, but at the same time, a strange feeling of hope began to blossom. The next morning, Caroline stood in front of Luchat as if she needed to confirm that what had happened the night before hadn't been a dream. She took out Robert's business card and looked at it again. Robert Griffin, founder and CEO of Elite Dining. She took a deep breath and entered the restaurant. The atmosphere was completely different from the night before. Everything was quiet, and the staff worked on morning preparations, following Robert's instructions. She climbed the stairs to his office. It was a small but elegant space with a panoramic view of the city of Boston. The walls were adorned with plaques and awards from the restaurant industry. Good morning, Caroline. Robert stood up as she entered and extended his hand. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation, Caroline replied, returning the handshake, although she couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Robert offered her coffee and gestured for her to sit down. Let me explain a little about my business, he began in a calm voice. Robert continued. Elite Dining isn't a very large group. I only manage this restaurant, Luchat, and another in the suburbs called Olive Terrace. It's a small business, but thanks to our focus on quality and customer experience, we've managed to build an excellent reputation. Caroline nodded as she listened attentively. I'm interested in your accounting skills, Robert added, offering her a cup of hot coffee. My business partner decided to retire suddenly last month, and I've been looking for someone to take charge of financial oversight. It's a small business but with great growth potential. Would you like to start as a financial manager? Caroline's eyes widened in surprise. Seriously? But I don't have experience in the restaurant industry. Sometimes a fresh perspective is needed, Robert replied with a smile. His eyes reflected sincerity and confidence. Your accounting experience is very valuable to us, and seeing you last night, I also noticed your strength. We need someone who knows how to stay calm under pressure. Caroline reflected on the offer. She needed a job, and the idea of a new challenge was intriguing. More than anything, she felt a strong desire to prove her worth far from the shadow of her family. Thank you, Mr. Griffin. I accept, she replied with determination. Wonderful, and please call me Robert, he said enthusiastically. You can start tomorrow. We'll discuss salary and conditions. Although her starting salary was slightly lower than in her previous job, Caroline felt reassured by the growth potential and the opportunity to start immediately. From her first day at Elite Dining, Caroline immersed herself in her new position. She analyzed the company's financial situation and reviewed the accounting books. She noticed that although the restaurants were profitable, there were several inefficiencies. After a few days of analysis, she compiled suggestions for improvement and presented them to Robert. This analysis is excellent, Robert commented, impressed as he reviewed her report. Especially the inventory management proposal. I'd like to implement it immediately. Caroline's recommendations began to be applied one after another, and in just 2 months, profits improved visibly. Caroline, your strategies have been impressive, Robert praised her at a management meeting. Profits have increased by 15% in just 2 months. Hiring you has been one of the best decisions I've ever made. Her co-workers also recognized her efforts, and the atmosphere in the restaurants became more dynamic. Caroline regained her confidence. However, one day her phone rang. Seeing the name on the screen, she felt a chill. Becky. She hesitated for a moment but finally answered. Caroline. Becky's voice trembled. I need to talk to you. What is it about? Caroline asked calmly. Caroline, it's terrible. Becky's voice sounded full of anxiety. Mom is seriously ill. She needs heart surgery, and the company is having serious problems. Caroline listened silently as her mind filled with doubts. Was this a trap? Or was it really an emergency? Please help me, Becky pleaded through tears. I have no one else to turn to. Caroline breathed. Tell me the details. According to Becky's explanation, Martha had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition that required expensive surgery. In addition, Barnes Construction was facing a severe financial crisis. Caroline, still suspicious, decided to investigate on her own. With Robert's permission, she took a few days off and began her own research. She visited the hospital and confirmed that Martha was indeed admitted. Then she used her contacts to obtain information about her father's company. The investigation revealed something shocking. Becky had diverted company funds for personal investments and had suffered huge losses. The company was on the verge of collapse, and Walter, her father, seemed not to fully understand the magnitude of the problem. Caroline returned to Robert's office and explained the situation. It's a complicated matter, Robert commented with a serious expression. What do you plan to do? Caroline looked out the window, reflecting. They hurt me, but they're still my family. Family is family, Robert said softly. But forgiving their mistakes is one thing, helping is another. My advice is not to get caught up in old emotions and think about what you can really do now. Caroline nodded, grateful for his words. She made a decision. She would support her mother's medical expenses with her savings and an advance from Robert. She could cover the surgery. However, regarding the company, she set clear conditions. She called Becky. I'll help you with Mom's situation, she said firmly. But you must speak honestly with Dad about the company and take responsibility. That's my only condition. On the other side of the line, Becky was silent before replying softly. Okay. Thank you, Caroline. Caroline hung up and sighed deeply. Her new life was taking an unexpected turn. However, this time she had the confidence to follow her own path. Her career with Robert in elite dining was giving her strength. Looking at the streets of Boston through the window, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Becky resisted Caroline's conditions. They were sitting in a cafe across from the hospital. Outside, a light rain continued to fall, and steam rose from the coffee cups on the table. There's no proof, Becky said, trying to sound firm as she lowered her voice. Don't blame me. The company's problems are due to the economic situation. Caroline replied calmly. She had anticipated this reaction. Becky, I'm a professional accountant. If necessary, I can thoroughly investigate. I can review transaction records, bank statements, everything. At those words, Becky's expression crumbled. For a moment, she played nervously with her hair and looked away. You still can't access the company's internal records, she murmured. I have contacts, Caroline replied in a calm but firm tone. And I could convince Dad to request an audit. Do you really want the truth to come out? That warning unsettled Becky. She turned her spoon over on the table several times and finally sighed deeply. Okay, I'll talk to Dad, she agreed, but then hesitated before adding her own condition. First, pay for Mom's surgery. If not, I can't tell Dad anything. Caroline stared at her. Becky's eyes reflected a mixture of fear and shame. She could have exploited her weakness, but she chose not to. Okay, she replied simply. But keep your word. That night, Caroline told Robert about the situation. They sat on the office sofa while he listened attentively. Caroline, if there's anything I can help you with, tell me, Robert said sincerely. I know it's a family problem, but I want to support you. Caroline was moved by his words. She never expected so much support from someone she had only known for a few months. Thank you, Robert, she said gratefully. With an advance, it would be enough. Robert shook his head. It won't be in advance. I'll give it to you as a bonus. A bonus? Caroline asked, surprised. Thanks to your work, the company's profits have increased considerably. This is well-deserved compensation. With Robert's backing, Caroline was able to arrange payment for her mother's surgery. On Sunday, she decided to visit her parents' house. The spacious mansion in the suburbs of Boston was still the same. But this time Caroline felt like a stranger in that place. Returning to her childhood home after so long awakened conflicting emotions in Caroline. Harsh and warm memories coexisted in that place. She rang the doorbell and waited nervously. Walter opened the door. He had aged visibly, and his face reflected weariness. Caroline, he said, surprised. Can I come in? She asked softly. In the living room, her mother was sitting in an armchair. She looked thinner and paler due to her illness. Caroline approached, took her hand, and looked at her tenderly. How are you feeling, Mom? Martha gave her a weak smile. I never thought you'd come, Caroline. Caroline took an envelope out of her bag and placed it on the table. This is for Mom's surgery. Walter frowned and took the envelope with trembling hands. Seeing the amount of money inside, his expression filled with astonishment. Why would you do something like this? Because we're family, Caroline replied, with no need for further explanation. Martha began to cry. I'm so sorry for how we treated you that night when you lost your job. We thought we were right, but we were terrible. Caroline gently squeezed her mother's hand. It's okay, Mom. I'd rather focus on the future. After a brief silence, she added, But Becky has something to tell you. Walter looked at her, confused. Becky? At that moment, the sound of the front door opening was heard. Becky entered. Noticing Caroline's gaze, she flinched for a moment, but she had returned as promised. In a low voice, she said, I have something to confess. She sat on the living room sofa and with a trembling voice began to speak. She revealed to her father that she had diverted company funds to make personal investments, but had failed and lost a considerable amount of money. Walter's face contorted with anger and pain. How could you do this? He shouted. I trusted you. Becky burst into tears. I'm sorry. I always wanted to prove I was better than Caroline. When I saw her go her own way, I also wanted to achieve success. I thought I could multiply the money with investments, but I failed. Walter sank heavily into a chair. His image as a strong father crumbled, leaving only an old man betrayed and dejected. How much money did you lose? He asked in a dull voice. Approximately $2 million, Becky replied in a murmur. The room fell into a stifling silence. Martha covered her face with her hands, and Walter remained motionless, immersed in the impact of the revelation. Caroline stood up, walked over to her father, and put a hand on his. Dad, instead of lamenting, let's think about how we can rebuild the company. I can suggest some financial strategies. Walter looked at her in disbelief. Why would you help us after how we treated you? Caroline sighed. Because despite everything, you're still my family. There was no blame or resentment in her voice. You hurt me that night, but it's time to leave that behind. Martha wiped her tears and looked at her tenderly. You've really become very strong, Caroline. Caroline smiled. It's not that I'm stronger. I just learned to recognize my own worth. I also understood that I can't stay trapped in the pain of the past. She asked her father to explain the company's situation in detail and proposed reviewing the financial statements. With Robert's advice, she began to develop a realistic recovery plan. The company would have to downsize significantly, but at least it could avoid total collapse. Becky, for her part, would assume legal responsibility and leave the company. Although she accepted the consequences of her actions through tears, she knew it was the right thing to do. Walter, although initially reluctant, ended up listening to Caroline's advice and was impressed by the depth of her financial knowledge. For the first time, he recognized the wisdom and strength his daughter had acquired by following her own path. Caroline, you've become an extraordinary person. I was wrong. Walter apologized sincerely, and for a moment uncommon tears shimmered in his eyes. Caroline smiled and patted him on the shoulder. Let's look ahead, Dad. The past is the past. Upon leaving, Caroline found herself alone with Becky at the entrance. Her sister looked down, ashamed. Thank you, Caroline. I was always envious of you. Becky confessed honestly. Caroline wrapped her arms around her sister's shoulders in a gentle hug. It's okay, Becky. We all make mistakes. Let's start over as sisters. Becky nodded through tears. Caroline said goodbye and got into her car. As she drove away from her parents' house, she felt a strange peace in her heart. A year later, Boston was permeated with the fresh air of spring. Martha had successfully completed her surgery and recovered well with rehabilitation. She had more energy than before and had resumed her volunteer activities in the community. Walter's company had downsized, but thanks to Caroline and Robert's advice, it managed to avoid bankruptcy. Over time, Walter began to consider retirement, and his once rigid attitude became more relaxed. He now regularly lunched with Caroline and listened enthusiastically to her stories about the business world. For their part, Caroline and Robert worked side by side to grow Elite Dining. Their professional partnership turned out to be incredibly successful, complementing each other in every strategic decision. Each one contributed their strengths. Entering their second year, they successfully opened a third restaurant in an emerging district of Boston called Nova. This new place quickly gained a reputation for its fusion of modern concepts with traditional flavors. Caroline became a partner in the business, and her financial management skills were key to the company's stability and expansion. Her name began to resonate in Boston business circles, and was even featured in local business magazines as a promising young executive. Her relationship with Robert also evolved naturally. What began as long work meetings turned into dinners and eventually dates. As their bond strengthened, they found understanding and true companionship in each other. 3 months after the opening of Nova, Robert proposed to Caroline and she accepted. Her parents were invited to the engagement party, an event filled with emotion and family reconciliation. Meanwhile, Becky took responsibility for the embezzlement at the company and was sentenced to 6 months of community service. During the trial, she apologized publicly and, after serving her sentence, tried to rebuild her career. However, in every job interview, her past came to light, making her feel like giving up. One day, she received an unexpected call. "Would you like to have coffee?" Caroline asked over the phone. Becky was surprised after everything she had done. "We all make mistakes, Becky. The important thing is how you recover from them." Caroline paused and then added, "How about Sunday at Nova?" That day, the sisters met at a quiet table on the restaurant's terrace. For the first time in a long time, they spoke sincerely and without resentment. Becky acknowledged her past jealousy and desires and apologized sincerely. "I was always envious of you," she confessed. "You followed your own path, and I always lived in Dad's shadow. I never knew what my true worth was." Caroline looked at her with understanding. "We're different people, Becky, and that's okay. Everyone has their own path." Then, with a smile, she made an unexpected proposal. "I'd like you to work in Elite Dining's marketing department. You have a talent for communication, and you could use it in another way." Becky burst into tears. "Thank you, Caroline. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity." A year and a half later, at Thanksgiving dinner, Caroline and Robert celebrated the opening of their new restaurant, The Last Supper. The restaurant's concept was a celebration of closing cycles, acceptance of the past, and new beginnings. The whole family attended the event, demonstrating that despite past conflicts, they had managed to overcome their differences and start anew. Martha approached Caroline and said, "I'm truly grateful that you forgave us." Caroline smiled and replied calmly, "The past is past. Now it's time to look to the future." Then she raised her champagne glass and proposed a toast. "To new beginnings." The whole family followed, raising their glasses in unison. "To new beginnings."